Geeks and Gamers, Matt Gear through Gamer Goggles, and welcome to Roleplay Ramblings. This is the second episode of Roleplay Ramblings, where I sit down and I chat about role-playing. GM tips, player tips, combination of the two. Today we're talking about whose story is it? And this is a conglomeration of whether or not it's a story that was pre-written for you, your own story, or whether or not your players tell the story. Which, actually, there is a role-playing game out there now called Valiant, where there isn't actually a GM telling the story. So, there's a lot of options and varieties and things you can do. But first, you know, GMs love to tell their story. They create the basic plot points for a story. But in the argument of, it's not really an argument, in the concept of whose story it is, players often spend a lot of time and they make an investment in their characters and developing that character. So, where I'm going with this is, should the GM be frustrated if players don't go from plot point to plot point? Or should players get frustrated if they don't necessarily get to do something that they think is in character? Now, there's basically two different ways to tell a story. You can buy a module. Well, I guess you can say there's three. You can buy a module, or well, that's what we called them when I was a kid. You can buy an adventure that is basically a one-shot. Basically, you know, it's for X level through X level, and they're usually like 40 or 50 pages. Many of us have played those. The other option is something like, well, okay, this is a special mention. It's Rise of the Runelords. It's really several adventures written into one, and this will take you all the way from first level to 18th level. But the storyline's written in such a way that there's a lot of different story options that a GM can take his players down. You could probably run 30 or 40 campaigns through here and never play it the same way twice. And then you have things like Prince of Apocalypse, or some of the older ones like Under Mountain from 3.5. These books are more like, while there's an adventure in them, the guidelines are, in my opinion, fairly loose, and the GMs have a tremendous amount of control over freedom, over their freedom to tell a story. They can use this as a backdrop even. They don't even need to use all of it. So, we're going to go back to the pre-constructed adventure. That is a small one-shot. These are things that I actually grew out of many years ago. I started playing in 3rd grade, and I think by 6th grade we were no longer using pre-constructed adventures. And there's a lot of reasons for that within my group. One is we felt they were too rigid. The storylines were too plot point based. It didn't fit our playstyle, was one of the biggest reasons. And from a GM perspective as a kid, I didn't want to read these. We didn't write down adventures. We just got together and we played and we told the story and we made it up as we went. With that being said, we did exactly what they were doing, and we had a plot point driven story. So I don't know. Maybe we were ahead of our time or something. But for me, the biggest problem is that it's plot point A to B to C to D to E to F. You don't get that so much in these kind of adventures, but in the smaller adventures, or like in your organized play adventures that are geared for one session, you really get that a lot. And I'm at a point in my playing career and my GMing career that kind of leaves your players only playing a role. So your paladin's truly just a paladin with little to no character development. And for some, that's what they want to do. I can go and I can do that at cons, but I can't do that in a long-term adventure, like the adventure that we've been playing for, oh my gosh, about 4 years now. Another reason why we moved away from these was White Plume Mountain, actually, which is a great adventure, and it's a great story, especially if you know the whole story behind it and all that, which I didn't when we played it. But we came up against the Manticore, and we were kind of led to believe by our GM that the Manticore was not something that we wanted to fight. It was going to kill us. So we sat around and we spent most of our night trying to figure out the riddle that the Manticore gave us. And it kind of just, we were just like, well, we can't get past the Manticore. This adventure is dumb. And that's where we were. And that's not the adventure's fault. That was really kind of more our GM's fault, because I think he just didn't want us to fight it. But as a result, we kind of moved away from it to just telling our own stories. And we, at that age, had a lot more fun doing it. Now, the other thing that is a little bit of a drawback is any adventure like this is going to be completely focused on getting to the final goal, which is usually defeating the ultimate bad guy of the story. And that's not something the player or the GM can really change in something that's so small. Now, when the GM tells his own story, there's a lot, aside from building their own world and everything, or using Galarian or Forgotten Realms or Cirrus as their only, as their backdrop, there's a lot of good things that come from this. You're no longer attached to a rigid storyline. You can add as many plot points as you want. You can throw as many fake leads down as you want. You can throw as many good leads down as you want. If you get in a pinch like we were with our Manticore and you're stuck, you can throw anything you want in to try and fix that. The Manticore can fly away. The Manticore can fall asleep, which he probably would. That's a little too easy, right? But you'll be able to avoid things more easily. At the same time, you can create many pitfalls. Now, I remember, this is probably about 5 years ago, I was running an adventure for some friends, and I had spent a lot of time creating this whole plot point thing. And this is probably the time when I moved away from plot pointing my stories. They got to a point, they cleaned out this goblin cave, and the party didn't want to leave. They wanted to stay and build a base. The problem was that the clues led them to an area that was like 500 miles away, and they didn't care. They knew that that's what they had to go do, and they didn't care. They wanted to stay and build their own fort in a place of peace. Needless to say, the adventure didn't go much farther than that, for obvious reasons. The players and the GMs just were not getting along. Now, that's one obvious pitfall that you can run into as a GM. You can build your plot points, and then, well, if you're not prepared to deal with players not doing what you planned, they can throw a loop into your game plan that you have to be able to correct as a GM, or your party might end. And I don't mean your player's party, I mean the party of playing. So, now, one of the problems that you might also create in this kind of adventure is having too many possible storylines. So you might leave clues to do one thing for several different people, or for your party, and then leave another set of clues, and they leave them going in directions here and here. So what you want to kind of do as a GM is give them enough variety that they can pick a direction, but in the end, that direction still needs to come back. I kind of like to look at telling a story for GMing kind of like a flame. You have the fuel on the bottom, which in my opinion is the party. You got the party, that's your kindling and your firewood. And then you've got the flames that come up and go in all these different directions. Some of them even spark off and disappear, And then at the top, you have the hottest point where your party meets to finish the story. So they start at the bottom as the fuel to the fire, They create the fire, they become a part of the story, and then they meet the bad guy at the top. I think that's ideal. Is it easy to balance that? Not always. And a good example of this is in one of the games that I've been playing, we have a party where about 75% of it has been focused very much on getting to the end goal. For whatever reason, we have an orc who is investigating the death of a friend. We have a psionicist who is investigating murders. We have a cleric who was told by the gods to come and help this group and be their spiritual leader. And we have me, who was sent to investigate it from his homeland. And then we have a sorcerer, the human sorcerer, who is actually investigating the same thing that we're all investigating. But he likes to do it alone, so he always sneaks off when we're in a dungeon. He always does this, he always does that. He looks for things in different places, and he tries to look for them when we're not around, so we don't know, he doesn't know us. And it's created a lot of problems. And bringing him back has been not easy. And it may not seem like that's a terrible problem, but the problem in this situation is we all have our own end goal within the story of the single end goal. And it's just created a little bit of conflict. Now, on the flip side of that, if you have too many plot points, it also gives you a lot of things that you can pull on as a GM if you're sharp and you're aware of everything that you've said and done. For example, we had this one instance where a player was told by the GM he should take a Consecrate Land spell because he was wanting the cleric to use it at a later time in the adventure. The cleric chose not to use this information. So we get all the way to the end of this session, and we come upon a well of souls, and in the well of souls is this cup. And the GM hints that the cleric should take his spell, Consecrate Land, and cast it. And the cleric goes, well, I didn't memorize that spell. and as players, we all just looked at him like, he told you to memorize that spell, you dummy. None of us actually came out and said you dummy, but like, what are you thinking was, something we said and stuff like that. So, the GM fell back upon part of the story thing that he put in the storyline. One of our characters was related to an individual who has, well, we were in the basement of a mansion, so it was related to somebody who was working there or training there. And the idea came across us that maybe the person who was in the lineage could reach in and pull the cup out from the Well of Souls, because it was being used to power it. So he played upon that and made the story work just as well, but he was going to have Consecrate Land pretty much do what he wanted it to do. Instead, with quick thinking, he fell into this trap of actually, well, not a trap, but he fixed the trap that he fell into. So as a GM, you should be careful with how much you plan for your adventurers, because they might do something that you don't want them to do, and then you'll have to think quickly on your feet. But I would say that having too many storylines or too many plot points within your storyline, or too many connections, too many connectors, is actually a good thing, because it gives you a lot of flexibility, as long as you can kind of keep your group together. Now, the third way to tell, the third of the four ways to tell the story is to let your players tell the story. Now, there's some huge pitfalls with this. If you give the players too much control, you won't be telling a story anymore. It'll be all about them, And there's some obvious problems with that, because if it's all about them, they're all trying to tell a story at the same time, obviously no one's really leading the group. Or you've got one player that's leading the group, and then the rest really aren't getting to be able to develop their characters at the same pace and level. What I suggest is that you use downtime to allow players to create character and fill some of those gaps where they might not normally get to. For example, my character in one adventure, he does a lot of gather information during his downtime. We have another character who likes to hunt, so he goes and he works on his hunting skills and training. We have another character that does a lot of research, so they go and do a lot of research on spiritual matters and on the planes. Obviously, some problems with the characters telling the story is that, well, they might decide that they don't want to follow your story anymore, which is what happened to me in the adventure where they wanted to build a fort. Another example is, well, maybe they just decided to become mercenaries, and while you wanted them to go kill that dragon, they've decided that they're just going to do other things. Eventually, you can probably work the dragon back into the storyline in this case. The other problem is that if everybody's trying to complete their character story, obviously there's going to be a certain amount of conflict among the group. And while conflict isn't necessarily bad, it's certainly not the best for your gameplay. So, in the end, I think the best way to tell your story as a GM is to make it a collaboration of minds between players, characters, and yes, I'm setting characters aside for a reason. They're important. It's important to set up that they're different from the players, and from the GM's point of view. Ultimately, I think the GM should have the most power at the table in a sense, because in effect it is the GM's story. The players and the characters are participants within that story, and I think a good GM will help characters mature within, not only within their storyline, but within their own storyline too. Because I believe that all characters should have things that guide them and influence them that are going to help them mature. For example, I mean, you look at a good book. If you look at a good book, you have, with most major characters in a good book, they go through some kind of change. They start off here, they might be uncertain. They go to this next step where they've maybe gained confidence, and then on the last step, they're heroes. And as a GM, I want to see, if I have a party of 5 players, 5 major changes happen over the courses of levels 1 to wherever we're going to end up. I think ideally you kind of want the changes to happen between 1 and 10, and then, because I think for the most part most people don't play beyond level 10. I could be a minority on that. But anyway, that is my thoughts on whose story it is. It's a collaboration of the GM's telling of the plot points and the characters that participate in the adventure. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to us. Look forward to my Kickstarter for Season 5. This actually has been a part of my Kickstarter for Season 4. And I have to thank people like Phil Reed, Casey Clark, Shoot Again Games, and Ozzy Cheney for making this happen. I couldn't have done it without them. I also have to thank Owen Stevens and Ryan Hale, 2 of my very good friends within the role-playing game community, for taking a look at my notes on these things and saying, hey, well, what about maybe this idea here, or this idea here. But anyway, thanks for watching. Please subscribe. Catch us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter. Follow us on Facebook. Tweet to me on Twitter. Anyway, have a good day.